In this video, you and I get to take a close look at calculating risk. Let's begin. In our nugget on risk concepts, we identified that a risk is the likelihood that a threat is going to exploit a vulnerability, resulting in some kind of a loss. So it's very likely that a company is going to want to put the controls in place to help reduce that risk, to mitigate that risk. Now, the question is, how much time, effort, and money should an organization like this one right here spend to mitigate a risk? Because at the end of the day, if there's a risk, for example, that we might lose $100 or 100 euros or whatever the currency is in your part of the world, if that's the total risk and the controls to mitigate that risk cost $10,000, you know what we should do? We probably just want to accept that risk and say, you know what? I can live with that risk because living with this risk of a $100 loss is a better business decision than spending $10,000 on a control that would help prevent that loss. Now, the next question is, how do we quantify exactly what a loss would cost? I mean, there's lots of factors involved. For example, if a server goes down, we have obviously to replace the server or repair the server. We also might have loss of revenue while that server is down. So, in addition to the hardware being replaced, we might also have some loss of sales and so forth during that downtime. Maybe customers who were normally shopping with us or doing business with us, they went elsewhere. So that results in a loss of a customer. And the trick is, how do we put a dollar amount or a cost on a given risk? And one method is to use a quantitative approach. And a quantitative approach is going to be using data that you've collected regarding losses that have happened in the past. And the end result, or at least the goal of a quantitative analysis for risk, is to put some hard numbers, some costs on risks. So, for example, if a company has risk 1, risk 2, and risk 3, the ideal situation would be to know, okay, this risk costs us $1,000, this risk costs us $3,000, and this risk costs us $18,000. And in these dollar amounts associated with the risk, the person who's calculated that has considered loss of business, loss of reputation, fines, hardware, software repairs, and so forth. And then from a business perspective, we could say, okay, great. This risk right here of $18,000, if this risk right here can be mitigated for $2,000, that probably is a good business decision. Spend $2,000 to save $18,000. So then the control to help mitigate that risk would be purchased for that $2,000, and then that risk is mitigated. So let's do an example of how we might calculate a risk. And as an example, let's use something that we all are familiar with, and that is hot water. You might be thinking, okay, Keith, how does hot water relate to risk? Well, let's take a hot water heater at a typical location, whether it's a home or an office or a business. So we have a hot water heater right here. And I'd like you to imagine that we are in charge, you and I are in charge of this water heater and its maintenance and everything else. And somebody contacts us and says, I've got a deal for you. What I want to do is sell you an insurance policy that for $250 a year, if anything goes wrong with that water heater, we will fix or repair or replace it, no questions asked, with 24-hour service. And all it'll cost you is $250 a year. Now, my question is, should we do that or not? Now, if we just jumped on it and said, okay, we'll purchase it, that's an example of doing risk transference. We're transferring the risk of that water heater failing and having us to purchase a whole new one. We're transferring it to the insurance salesperson who, for the fee of $250 a year, is going to cover the complete cost of a repair in the event of failure. Now, the question is, from a business perspective, should we do that, yes or no? And see, without the quantitative analysis and without the numbers involved, we really don't know if that's a good decision or not. So here's one method in a quantitative approach that we could use to identify whether or not we should spend the $250 a year. The first number we might use is something called the single loss expectancy, right here. Single loss expectancy. That's effectively, if this water heater totally fails, what's going to be the cost to replace that water heater if we had to buy one brand new? And what the SLE is, the single loss expectancy, would be the replacement cost. And we could also factor in, for example, the costs such as the labor and the parts and the hardware for a brand new install. And let's say for our purposes here that the single loss expectancy is $1,100. Now, in an actual risk assessment, there would be other factors involved besides just the labor and hardware to install a new water heater. We'd also have, for example, what if we had a catastrophic failure of the existing water heater and there was water damage that was done, because that would also factor in. So in many organizations, if we do have a significant failure and we have water damage, most organizations are going to transfer that risk as well by having some type of insurance on the building. So if something does happen like that, from a water damage perspective, the insurance that they've already purchased would be an example of a mitigation technique regarding that risk, and that would also be using a transference of that risk by purchasing the building insurance. So back to our specific water heater, the single loss expectancy, let's say, is $1,100. The next question to ask ourselves would be, okay, based on the data and the history, how long do we think that water heater is going to survive and last before it needs to be replaced? I mean, certainly a water heater shouldn't have to be replaced every single year, and that's going to go into our calculation. So the next piece we'd use is called the ARO, which is the annualized rate of occurrence. So the OCC there is short for the word occurrence. How often every year is that going to happen? So to figure that out, now if an average water heater did fail every single year, that'd be an easy calculation. For example, we could say it happens one time a year. But for our example, let's say that based on the model that we have and the history and the data that we have on that model of water heater, let's say that the water heater fails approximately every 5 years. Now, you know what that means? It means it's time to start looking for a different vendor of water heater. In any event, for example, let's say it's 5 years is the average time before a water heater fails. So how do we take 5 years and get an annualized rate of occurrence? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take the 5, that's the 5 years, and we're going to divide it into 1. Now, obviously 5 doesn't go into 1. However, we can start playing with a decimal point, and we can bring that to a 1, 0. So it goes into 1 exactly 0 times. And then if we bring this down, and the remainder is 10, and 5 goes into 10 exactly 2 times. So our annualized rate of occurrence, our ARO, is going to be 0.2. Again, it would be a lot easier if water heaters failed every year, or that model did, but it's really easy to calculate it. So anytime you have something that happens less than once a year, you'd go ahead and do this division exercise. If it happens more than once a year, for example, if it happened like 8 times a year, you'd simply use 8 for the ARO. Another scenario perhaps would be, let's say we had 100 water heaters, and on average they failed every 5 years. You'd take the ARO and you'd multiply it by 100, because that's the ARO for a single water heater. So if we had 100, the ARO would be 20. Just moving the decimal point over a couple if we had 100 of these water heaters that we were all factoring in. But sticking on our single water heater, the last thing we need to do is calculate the ALE, which stands for the annualized loss expectancy. And the annualized loss expectancy goes like this. The ALE equals the single loss expectancy times how often it's going to happen, which is the ARO. So if we do that math and we take $1,100 times 0.2, we're going to have 0, 2 times 0 is 0, 2 times 1 is 2, and 2 times 1 is 2. And we had to move the decimal point over 1 right there because of the 0.2. So our annualized loss expectancy is $220 for that single water heater. So should we purchase the insurance that says, hey, for $250 we'll cover your risk of the expense of that failing? And the answer is we probably should just accept the risk, because it's really only costing us $220 a year on average. So it doesn't make sense for us to spend more money, the $250 on insurance, to transfer that risk to the insurance company when we can just accept the risk for $220 a year, and we'd be saving $30 a year. And that's an example of quantitative risk calculation. In another example of risk calculation, let's go ahead and take a software application. Let's go ahead and say we have a custom app that was written for us, and we've been using it for a couple of years. And unfortunately, the company that wrote the software for us, they are out of business, but we use something called a software escrow. So all the source code is sitting and available in the event we need to look at it through an escrow company. Also, regarding this application, let's say that we're planning on using it for another, let's say, 3 years. And after that 3 years, we're going to have a whole new application. Or maybe we're going to move to software as a service up in the cloud or something else. But we're expecting 3 more years of life out of this custom application that we need for the business. Now let's say we had an update to a server, an operating system update, and as a result, one of the features of this custom app failed. Let's say, for example, it was self-service password changes. For example, in our company policy, we might have a policy that every password has to be changed at least every 45 days. And on this specific application, the self-service password changes feature fails or no longer works. So we may hire a part-time person to come in and assist the help desk, for example, with doing customer password changes. And we would set it up to do it in a fairly secure manner to verify who that user really is. But let's say that part-time person is going to cost us $1,000 a month. And the whole thing is required because the self-service password changes feature is no longer working, and we need this part-time person to help make up the difference in assisting at the help desk. And let's say furthermore that we get a call from a salesperson who says, you know what, I've got a programming development team. They're familiar with your type of software application that you're using. If you want, we can go ahead and get your source code out of escrow, and we can look at it and we can write a patch for you. It'd take us 1 month to do it. So we'll write here a custom update. Actually, we'll say a custom fix to fix that problem. And let's say they're going to charge us $25,000 to do it. And it would take a single month to do it. So even if we hired this company for the custom fix, we'd still have that person part-time for the month while they were implementing the fix. Now the question is, should we do this? Yes or no? Should we pay the $25,000 to get it fixed, or should we just hire the part-time person, $1,000 a month for 3 more years to go ahead and continue doing what that part-time person is doing? So let's run the numbers. If we take a look at the single loss expectancy, the single loss expectancy is hiring that person for $1,000 a month. So if we look at this at a monthly basis, we're looking at $1,000 for every month that we have to hire that person to come in and assist us with doing the help desk support and resetting the passwords along with the user's cooperation. So next we have the annualized rate of occurrence. How often are we doing that? Well, if it's monthly where we're paying that part-time person to come in, that's happening 12 times during the year. So the annual rate of occurrence of that monthly charge of $1,000 is 12. And then finally we have the annual loss expectancy, which is just the SLE times the ARO, which would be 1,000 times 12 for a whopping $12,000 a year. So if we look at the big picture, if we're expecting to have that application for 3 more years, and we're expecting an annual loss expectancy of $12,000 per year, over that 3-year period, that's $36,000. And you know what? If they really could do it for $25K, from a dollars and cents perspective, it would make sense to do the custom fix instead of just paying the person $1,000 a month to go ahead and manually assist us. Now this same exact scenario could apply if we had a security flaw and maybe we had to spend $1,000 a month in mitigating that security issue versus spending $25,000 to have somebody come in and write a patch that fixes it all at once. So the comparison here would be we have $36,000 in one corner versus $26,000 in the other. You might be saying, well, Keith, it's only $25,000 for them to implement that solution. Where'd the extra $1,000 come from? Well, it takes them a month to implement it. So during that 1 month, in this scenario, we'd still need that part-time person until the custom fix that fixes that problem was implemented. And in this example, the control, if you will, was the new software that could remove the problem, thus providing mitigation. Now, one of the challenges I have as I look at the annualized rate of occurrence and the single loss expectancy and the annualized loss expectancy is that in a real-world environment, there's lots of other factors involved. In a certification environment, just take what they give you as face value and don't try to factor in anything else other than what they give you. So in the event you do need to calculate what the annualized loss expectancy is and whether the customer should transfer that risk through insurance or put in a control to mitigate that risk or simply accept the risk and say, you know what, it's less expensive for me to accept the risk. Just use the numbers that they're providing you. And by taking that approach of just using what they've given you and not reading any further into it, you'll be able to use that quantitative approach in a certification environment using the SLE, the ARO, to calculate the final ALE and then decide what the best course of action should be. Now, one of the challenges that we often have in actually assigning a risk as a quantitative value is that we don't have a lot of data, for example, on the actual impact. I mean, if this server goes down, what is the true impact? It's not just the loss of the actual hardware. What is the impact in customer sales and reputation and so forth? And what is the likelihood of attack X or attack Y acting as a threat actually being successful, or day zero attacks being successful against the server? In those types of situations where we don't just have all the data that we would love to have, sometimes we might use a qualitative approach as opposed to quantitative. And qualitative risk analysis is usually using the expert opinion and judgment of people based on what they think is very likely to happen and the probability of it occurring. So for qualitative, the likelihood and the impact are really judgment calls. And in the fast-paced changing world that we live in, having a qualitative opinion of what is likely to happen or probably will happen may be the best that we can do, but it's still better than doing nothing at all. Some other factors that we might use to help estimate the reliability of the components or our systems, and let's start with MTBF right here. That stands for the mean time between failure. And that's a measurement of reliability before a device fails. And it's usually expressed in hours. For example, let's say that you and I are interested in purchasing some solid-state drives, and we're comparing two different vendors. And we're wondering, okay, which one is going to be more reliable? They're both about the same speed. Which one's going to be more reliable? If one was listed at 2 million hours for the MTBF, the mean time between failure, and the other one was listed at 3 million for the MTBF value, the mean time between failure, and that would indicate that this drive with the 3 million MTBF is likely to fail later than the drive with a 2 million MTBF. And it's not a question for any electronic component. It's not really a question of if it's going to fail. The question is when it's going to fail. And with an MTBF like 2 or 3 million hours, it's very likely the technology is going to be outdated way before most of that hardware is going to fail. Now, does that mean we don't need to back up our data, that those disk storage devices are perfect? The answer is there's a lot going on. We could have devices that write data incorrectly. We could have device failure still. And in the big picture regarding data, there's only two types of users. There's people who have lost data in the past and people who will lose data in the future. So even with huge MTBFs and drives being a lot more reliable than they were a decade ago, we still want to make sure we're doing backups and high availability and fault tolerance for all of our critical systems. The MTTR stands for the mean time to restore. I've also seen it written as mean time to repair, which is referring to the time it would take to repair or restore a failed system. And there are several factors that go into that. For example, let's say we have this server and it does have some component that fails, and then we need to get that server back up and running. Now, if we don't have the actual part sitting here in a building that we can just swap back in, of course that's going to affect the overall reality of how long it's going to take to get that repaired. So we have to order the part and have it shipped over to us and then have a technician install it. There's a lot of factors that can help delay the restoration of that system. But MTTR, the mean time to restore, is the time needed to repair a failed hardware module. So in that case, lower is better, meaning it's going to be faster to repair. And the MTTF is the mean time to failure. So with mean time to failure, a bigger number is better. And basically, it's a measurement regarding the reliability for non-repairable systems, meaning you install it, you use it, and when it's done, it's done. So the MTTR, the MTTF, and the MTBF could all be used as inputs for a qualitative assessment, including for estimations of when a component may fail, and if it does fail, how long it might take to restore it back to a functioning state. A threat vector, also sometimes called an attack vector, is the method that could be used by a threat to exploit or compromise one of our existing vulnerabilities. So for example, a web page could be an attack vector or a threat vector. So if we can get Bob, for example, to go out and visit our web page and click on a link, which either downloads something to Bob's computer or runs something on memory, and nothing in our network stops that, nothing at Bob's computer or nothing in the network itself that was doing malware protection, that would be a vector that an attacker, that would be a vector that could be used, that pathway, if you will, for the attacker to go ahead and compromise our systems. Other methods could be email. If somebody does a phishing attack, for example, and Bob clicks on an attachment and opens something and runs something, that would be another vector, another method that could be used to compromise our systems. Instant messaging, a lot of peer-to-peer applications. Social media has a lot of stuff lurking in the corners there. The telephone could also be used. For example, someone calls Bob up on the phone, maybe they spoof the caller ID so it looks like it's some legitimate company, and the person on the phone says, yes, we are in charge of Microsoft's deployment for a lot of their Windows operating systems, and we've received information that your computer has tons of problems with it, and we'd like to take a moment and help you correct those right now. And so they have Bob do a few commands at the CLI of his computer, and then the caller, as the attacker, I should say the attacker, not the caller, as he's on the phone with Bob and he's reinforcing with Bob that he really is a valid technician. Maybe he'll have Bob do some basic commands, and then the technician will say, okay, read this number because that's how you can prove that I really am authorized by Microsoft to help you troubleshoot your problem. And then eventually the caller is going to have Bob do something that indeed would compromise his system. Either go to a specific website, maybe run some remote control software so that the attacker can remotely take control of Bob's computer. So all of these could be attack vectors or threat vectors that are used to compromise our confidentiality, data integrity, or availability of our systems. As part of our risk calculation, we're absolutely going to consider the likelihood of an event actually happening and the probability of that threat being successful against the resources and assets in our network. And based on the cost of those risks, we're very likely going to implement countermeasures to help reduce that risk. For example, a security policy. The entire purpose of it is to help reduce risk. Now, regarding what we can do regarding the risk, we can avoid a risk. For example, BYOD is the bring your own device concept, and every company really does need to have a BYOD policy, meaning they are allowed or they are not allowed, or if they are going to get on the network, what do they have to do to get on, and so forth. So let's say, for example, that the company's done a risk analysis and they've decided that it's just too risky for people, if they bring their own devices to work, to have them connect in any fashion to the network. And if they enforced that policy and told the employees, made them sign agreements that they shall not connect or bring in any personal devices, that would be an example of risk avoidance, because they're simply not going to allow those wireless devices on their network. Now, of course, we'd also want to have technical controls that would enforce that policy so the users wouldn't be able to get on the network. Another attitude or action that we can take regarding risk is transference. And primarily a transference of risk is done with insurance. We're purchasing insurance that will cover the risk. Another option might be that we are going to mitigate the risk. For example, if there's a risk that malware could be going through our network, we might want to implement a technical control such as an application-aware firewall that has the ability to look for malware and stop it, or run antivirus software and keep it up to date on the PC. And those would both be examples of mitigation or mitigating the risk. And the reality is, even with those controls in place, there is some possibility still that something may happen. And we often refer to that as residual risk. And a company, if they didn't want to deal with that, they could get insurance for that residual risk, or they could just go ahead and accept that residual risk. Or in our example with the water heater, we could just accept the risk because the cost of the mitigation would be more than the actual risk itself. In either case, acceptance is one approach when it makes business sense regarding risk. And deterrence can be used with the other methods as well. For example, let's say that we have a policy that says when people enter the building, right here through this door, that each one of them, one by one, has to go ahead and swipe their card or hold up their card close to the badge reader. So we have an audit record of exactly who's going in the building, when they're coming out of the building, and what timestamps those are happening at. Well, if our policy is that everybody needs to show their own badge, what happens if we have two people that try to sneak in together? And that's often referred to as tailgating or piggybacking. How could we deter that behavior? Well, there's a couple of options. We could use like a man trap. And a man trap only allows one person through at a time with physical controls normally. Or like a double door system that forces no tailgating or piggybacking. Or we could use a security guard that is sitting there watching everybody as they go in. That would act as a great deterrent, because everybody going in knows the security guard is right there and they're going to get stopped if they try to do piggybacking or tailgating. And another option would be cameras with a big blinky light with a little sign saying this is being recorded. So that as people go in, they know that behind that camera, there could be somebody watching them right then, or there could be somebody later who's reviewing those tapes, or that DVR that could identify that they're breaking policy by not entering the building one person at a time, each with their own ID badge. These would all be examples of physical controls. Now, in a service provider environment, if we have one giant piece of hardware, and it's very likely we have lots of giant pieces of hardware, but if we're providing services for our customers, maybe software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, here's customer A, here's customer B, here's customer C. Anytime we have multiple tenants or customers that are sharing the same physical resources, there's the additional opportunity for us to do something wrong, which might allow one of those virtualized environments to compromise the other. So a couple of things we need to be aware of. Number one, whoever is setting up the virtualization for us, we need to do it correctly from a service provider perspective. And that could involve, for example, virtual switches, virtual firewalls to make sure that the separation is happening logically between those virtual environments. And then once we get into a specific virtual environment like customer A's, for example, the same concepts apply in their virtualized environment as they would in a physical. Customer A needs to make sure that they're doing network separation and using things like access control lists and firewalls and intrusion detection and prevention, because although the connectivity between the devices has been moved up into a virtual environment, we still want to maintain the proper controls to mitigate risk, and we're going to use a lot of the same exact methods, except they're going to be virtualized along with the servers and the networks that are being provided to us from a service provider. So as far as risks associated with cloud computing and virtualization, I would say everything we had before as risks still exist in the cloud. And then above and beyond that, we're going to have all the issues related to the virtualization to make sure that all of our devices and components and systems have that logical separation with the integrated firewalls and access control implemented. And part of the reason that sometimes we might overlook security aspects in the cloud is that we don't see the physical resources. For example, we know where this switch is in the wiring closet. We know where that router is. We know where that firewall is if they are all physical devices. We can see the physical cables and connections. In a virtualized environment, we're not going to be able to walk up to a firewall and track the cable from one interface going to another port on another device because it's virtualized. But we do need to take the same care to make sure that the connections in that virtual environment are correctly set up so that we can have our proper controls in place to implement our same level of security in this virtualized space. I'd like you to imagine that we are hosting our own server. So this is our physical server here, and we use it for customer interfacing for transactions within our business. So the local hard drive, the processor, all the details on this server are pretty important to our business. Next, I'd like you to imagine with me that this server went completely down. As my friend Kyle likes to say, somebody let the smoke out of it. So it caught on fire or something terrible happened and it was a complete disaster. Now, the reality is we want to get that server or that service back up. We might have to replace the physical hardware, do data restores. And so the question is, how long is it going to take? Let's say the disaster happened right here. Here's the outage, and this blue line is representing time. So as time marches on, eventually we want to get that guy back online. And the question is, how fast do we want to get it back online? Now, of course, we want it to be immediately, but we need to make sure we have the resources to make that happen. So this RTO right here, the recovery time objective, is the goal, if you will, of how quickly, how much time it's going to take after an outage to get that restored and back online and working. So this is the RTO. So if each of these notches represent hours, maybe our recovery time objective is 1, 2, 3 hours in this example. And the shorter the RTO, the more it's going to cost to make sure that you can do it. And the longer the RTO, for example, if the RTO was, well, we need to bring it back up in a couple weeks, to do a couple weeks, you really wouldn't have to have a hot spare physical device anywhere close. You could wait for shipping to happen as far as the hardware is concerned, and then once it comes in, you'd restore the data and be up and running. So the RTO is looking into the future, how long to get the system back up and running. Now the other question is, when it does get back up and running, how far back do you want to be able to restore to? Which is also a time consideration. and that's expressed as the RPO, the recovery point objective. So as we go back in time, the question is, how far back do you want to be able to go for restoration? Do you want to be able to go back a year or a day or a week? And let's say the RPO wants to be able to go back 1 week if needed. So it's rolling forward. We can always go back to at least 1 week ago if we need to, and we'll call that our RPO point. So at the end of the day, to get that new server up and running, we're going to need to have, in this case, a new physical server if the other one burned up. And then on that new server, a restoration of the data. We should also be aware that if we did have a server that went down here and then we restored it here with data from a week ago, obviously we're going to be missing all the new data since that 1 week ago. So the RPO, it may be, for example, we need to restore back to the last 30 minutes before the system went down. And it completely depends on the type of service that you're running, and most importantly, what you've decided as a company you need that RPO to be. I have had a lot of fun with you in this video, and I'm glad that you joined me for it. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.